Have you ever felt that the more you understand about the world, the more distant you become from the people around you? Have you noticed that conversations feel empty? That nobody wants to discuss what really matters? And that your doubts bother more than they interest? This feeling isn't a sign that you're wrong. In fact, it might be the opposite. It might be that you've started a journey that few have the courage to follow through to the end. And this journey, as many have discovered throughout history, almost always leads to a lonely place. Every human being is born surrounded by ready-made beliefs, ancient traditions, and truths that nobody questions. From an early age, we learn what to think, what to feel, and what to desire. Family teaches, school repeats, religion reinforces, and society demands. Everything seems to work as long as you accept the complete package. But there's a moment, for some people, when something changes. An uncomfortable question arises. A doubt that won't leave your mind. A thought that challenges everything you were taught. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can pretend you didn't see it, swallow the restlessness, and go with the flow. Or you can take the first step toward the truth. And if you choose the second path, know that it rarely has company. This choice isn't new. Throughout the centuries, many have faced the same dilemma. And one of the most powerful examples comes from a man who lived more than 300 years ago. Baruch Spinoza was born into a Jewish community in Amsterdam in the 17th century. He grew up studying sacred texts, learning the tradition of his ancestors, and being prepared to be a respected member of the synagogue. But Spinoza had something that bothered the religious leaders. He asked questions, real questions. He wanted to understand God not through rituals or dogmas, but through reason. He wanted to comprehend nature in a deep, real way, without depending on ancient stories or ready-made interpretations. For the leaders of his community, this was a threat. Questioning was dangerous. Thinking freely was heresy. So in 1656, when Spinoza was only 23 years old, he was excommunicated, expelled from the synagogue, publicly cursed. No one could speak with him, do business with him, or even approach him. His family rejected him. His friends abandoned him. He was condemned to total isolation. And you know what Spinoza did in the face of that? He didn't back down. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't take back his ideas. He chose to think freely, even knowing that it meant walking alone. Intellectual freedom seems like something beautiful when we talk about it. It seems noble, inspiring, desirable. But in practice, it demands a high price. For Spinoza, thinking clearly meant freeing himself from religious dogmas, from unquestionable authorities, from truths imposed by tradition. He wanted to understand the universe as it really is, not as people wanted it to be. But doing this had consequences. By questioning the beliefs of his community, he lost his support network. He lost the social bonds that sustain anyone's life. He lost the protection of family, the warmth of friendship, the comfort of belonging to a group. Freedom of thought, for Spinoza, didn't come accompanied by applause or recognition. It came accompanied by silence, rejection, and loneliness. And this is the pattern. When you start thinking for yourself, when you stop repeating what everyone says and start seeking your own answers, you naturally distance yourself from the majority. Not because you're better, but because you're playing a different game. And this game, most of the time, has no cheering section. Spinoza observed the world around him and saw something that bothered him. He saw that most people lived enslaved, not by physical chains, but by something worse. They were slaves to their own passions, their own desires, their own fears. They lived reacting to impulses without understanding what was happening. They felt anger without knowing where it came from. They felt envy without realizing what fed it. They felt hope in things that would never happen, and fear of things that would never come. And worst of all, they thought they were in control. They thought their choices were free, that their opinions were their own, that their dreams were authentic. But Spinoza clearly saw that all of this was illusion. People didn't choose freely. They just followed internal and external forces they didn't understand. They lived like leaves carried by the wind, thinking they were flying by their own will. Questioning this reality is challenging the foundation of human coexistence. It's saying that people are mistaken about themselves, and nobody likes to hear that. Society functions because everyone agrees to believe in the same illusions. When someone points out these illusions, they become a threat. And that's why few tolerate those who do this. One of Spinoza's most powerful phrases perfectly sums up why the seeker of truth ends up isolated. He wrote, "Men think they are free, but this freedom is nothing more than ignorance of the causes that determine them." Read that again. Think about what it means. People think they're in control, but they only think that because they don't see the forces that really command their lives. It's like a puppet that doesn't see the strings. It moves and thinks it's dancing freely, but it's actually being pulled by something it doesn't notice. When you start seeing these strings, when you start understanding the real causes of things, you automatically distance yourself from those who still think they're dancing alone. Not because you want to feel superior, but because you see something that others prefer not to see, and this creates an abyss. On one side are people living in the comfortable illusion that they control their lives. On the other side is you, knowing that almost nothing is really free. This abyss isn't arrogance, it's lucidity. And lucidity, most of the time, walks alone. Loneliness begins the moment the illusion falls. When you still believed in the same things as everyone else, everything was easier. Conversations flowed. Friendships made sense. You felt part of something bigger. But when you start understanding the nature of things clearly, when you see beyond appearances, something changes. You realize that a large part of society is trapped in comfortable narratives. Narratives that explain the world in simple ways, that give quick answers to difficult questions, that guarantee everything has a clear purpose, and that in the end, everything will work out. These narratives function as anesthetics. They take away the pain of uncertainty, mask the fear of death, hide the complexity of existence, and most people need them to keep living. But when you see these narratives for what they really are, when you realize they're just human constructions to deal with the unknown, you can no longer believe in them. And that's when the problem begins. You try to talk about what you've discovered, but nobody wants to listen. People change the subject, get uncomfortable, look at you as if you're exaggerating, because deep down they know that if they stop to really think, the house of cards collapses. And they don't want it to collapse. They prefer the comfortable illusion to the uncomfortable truth. At this moment, you realize you're in different territory, and in this territory there's rarely company. Spinoza knew this very well. He understood that reason is a narrow path, not because it's hard to access, but because few people have the willingness to follow it to the end. Most start the journey but give up halfway. They give up because reason demands brutal honesty. It doesn't accept half-truths, doesn't tolerate self-deception, doesn't allow you to believe in something just because it's comforting. Reason forces you to look at reality as it is, even when it hurts. And that's heavy. It's much easier to go with the current. Repeat what everyone says. Accept the ready-made answers. That's why few follow reason to the end. And those who insist on this journey find themselves often walking alone. Not out of pride. Not because they think they're better than others, but simply due to lack of real company. It's hard to share a journey with someone who gave up on it a long time ago. It's hard to talk about deep truths with someone who prefers to stay on the surface. And as much as you try, as much as you look for people who think similarly, the reality is they're rare. And even when you find them, they're also fighting their own internal battles. So loneliness isn't a conscious choice. It's a natural consequence of following a path that few walk. After being rejected by the Jewish community, Spinoza made a decision. He chose a simple, solitary, and contemplative life. He worked as a lens grinder, a manual trade that paid the bills but didn't demand much from the mind. This gave him time to think, to write, to develop his philosophy in silence. He didn't seek fame. He didn't try to form a group of followers. He didn't want to create a new religion or movement. He just lived quietly, writing his ideas and sharing with the few close friends who truly understood what he was doing. His loneliness wasn't a punishment he suffered. It was a conscious choice. He knew that preserving inner freedom was more important than social recognition. He knew that maintaining clarity of thought was worth more than popularity, and he accepted the price it demanded. Many see Spinoza's life as sad, as an example of excessive sacrifice, but he didn't see it that way. For him, loneliness was the price of freedom, and freedom was the most precious thing that existed. Better to be alone and free than accompanied and trapped. Better to think clearly in silence than to get lost in the noise of crowds. This was his life philosophy, and that's how he lived until the end. It's important to understand that separating yourself from the crowd isn't hatred. It isn't contempt. It isn't thinking you're special and others are fools. Spinoza didn't despise people. On the contrary, he had a deep understanding of human passions, fears, hopes, weaknesses. He understood why people lived the way they lived. He understood why they clung to beliefs without questioning. He understood why they needed comforting narratives. He didn't judge this as something morally wrong. He just recognized that it was so. And precisely because he understood human limitations so well, he knew he couldn't live immersed in that. Not because he was superior, but because he had chosen a different path. A path that required distance. He withdrew not out of misanthropy, but out of necessity. Because he knew that the search for truth requires a space free from collective storms. It requires silence. It requires isolation. Passions are contagious. Fear is contagious. Anger is contagious. When you're in the middle of the crowd, it becomes very difficult not to be dragged by these forces. So, to maintain clarity, Spinoza chose distance. Not as escape, but as strategy, as protection of the inner space where truth could flourish. For Spinoza, crowds are guided by effects: fear, hope, envy, hatred, love, ambition. These feelings dominate collective life. They determine how people vote, what they consume, what they believe, who they fight with. The entire society functions as a great game of emotions. And as long as someone is dragged by these impulses, they won't be able to understand reality clearly. It's impossible to see the truth when you're angry. It's impossible to think rationally when you're afraid. It's impossible to be objective when you're taken by hope or despair. Passions cloud the mind. They distort perception. They make you see what doesn't exist and ignore what's right in front of you. Spinoza observed this happening all the time. He saw how the masses were manipulated by leaders who knew how to exploit these passions. He saw how wars were waged through collective hatred, how religions prospered through fear of death, how governments maintained themselves through hope for a better future. And he knew that as long as people continued being moved by these forces, they would never be truly free. Real freedom, for Spinoza, wasn't doing whatever you wanted. It was understanding the causes of things and acting according to reason, not passions. And this, for most, was impossible, because they were completely immersed in passions without even realizing it. The seeker of truth doesn't reject the world. They just learn to be guided by something different. They learn to use reason as an inner lighthouse. A lighthouse that shines even when everything around is plunged in confusion. While most let themselves be carried by the waves of collective emotions, those who developed this inner lighthouse managed to stay firm. They managed to see beyond the immediate chaos. They managed to distinguish what is real from what is just emotional reaction. But this lighthouse doesn't shout. It doesn't call attention. It's silent. It shines only for those who carry it. And this again leads to loneliness. Because you can't show your lighthouse to others. You can't make them see what you see. Each person needs to light their own lighthouse. And most never do. So you follow your path illuminated by reason, while around you everyone follows paths illuminated by emotions. And these paths rarely cross. You're not above them. You're just in another direction. And that direction most of the time is solitary. But for those who truly seek truth, there's no other choice. Turning off the lighthouse to fit in would be betraying yourself. It would be giving up the only thing that really matters. So you continue, even alone. Because the lighthouse isn't just a tool. It's who you've become. Spinoza saw loneliness in a different way from most. For him, it wasn't a void to be filled. It wasn't a sadness to be cured. It was, in fact, an opportunity. An opportunity to purify thought, to clean the mind of all distractions, others' opinions, social pressures, and emotional noise. When you're alone, truly alone, you have the chance to hear your own thoughts without interference. You can question your beliefs without fear of judgment. You can explore dangerous ideas without being censored. You can make mistakes without being ridiculed. Loneliness creates an internal laboratory where the mind can experiment freely. Far from social noise, from constant chatter, from unsolicited opinions, the mind finally manages to breathe. It manages to think slowly, carefully, deeply. And in this silent space, something happens. You start to contemplate the eternal order of nature with serenity. You start noticing patterns that previously went unnoticed. You start understanding connections that the world's noise hid. Loneliness then transforms from burden to gift, from punishment to privilege, because it's in it that true understanding is born. Not in the middle of the party, not during heated discussion, not in the rush of everyday life, but in silence. In the void that scares most, but for the truth seeker, is fertile ground. In Spinoza's view, knowing the real causes of things is the path to liberation. When you understand why something happens, when you see the chain of causes and effects that leads to a result, you stop being a passive victim. You stop reacting blindly. You start understanding. And understanding brings freedom. Not the freedom to change everything, because much in reality is necessary and cannot be altered, but the inner freedom to accept what is necessary without suffering unnecessarily, to act with wisdom within the limits of what's possible, to no longer be a slave to your own passions. This liberation isn't social. Nobody's going to give you a medal for it. Nobody's going to publicly recognize your achievement. It's an inner liberation, silent, invisible to the world, and it usually happens in solitude. Because it's in solitude that you have time and space to study causes, to reflect deeply, to connect the dots. It's in solitude that you can face uncomfortable truths about yourself without having to keep up appearances. You can admit your weaknesses, recognize your destructive patterns, identify the passions that enslave you. And gradually, through this solitary inner work, you free yourself. Not completely, because we're always human and will always have passions, but enough to no longer be controlled by them. And this freedom, however small it may seem, changes everything. It transforms your relationship with the world, but not necessarily your relationship with people, because people remain trapped, and whoever is free can no longer fully relate to those who are trapped. Spinoza's ultimate goal wasn't to escape the world. It wasn't to hide in a cave and never talk to anyone again. His goal was to achieve something he called beatitude, a state of deep, serene, constant joy. A joy that didn't depend on external events, material achievements, social recognition. A joy that was born from understanding. When you understand the necessity of reality, when you see that everything happens according to eternal and immutable laws, when you realize you're part of this cosmic order, something quiets within. You stop fighting against what you can't change. You stop lamenting what had to happen. You stop having unrealistic expectations about how the world should be. And in this state of deep acceptance, beatitude emerges. A peace that can't be taken from you, because it doesn't depend on anything external. Loneliness, then, transforms into beatitude. It stops being suffering to become the place where this inner peace flourishes. You no longer need crowds to feel complete. You no longer need approval to feel validated. You no longer need distractions to escape from yourself. Loneliness becomes home, becomes sanctuary, becomes the sacred space where true joy dwells. And when you achieve this, you realize you were never really alone, because you were accompanied by the only thing that really matters: understanding of reality as it is. Spinoza was fully aware that the path of reason doesn't receive applause. He knew that most people wouldn't understand his quest. He knew many would find his ideas dangerous, heretical, absurd. He knew he'd be criticized, rejected, forgotten, and indeed he was. During his lifetime, he published only one book anonymously. His other works were only published after his death, and even then caused scandal. His books were banned. His ideas were attacked by philosophers, theologians, and politicians. He was called an atheist, a blasphemer, a destroyer of morality. And all this because he sought truth, because he refused to accept ready-made answers, because he insisted on thinking freely. Society punished this courage with isolation, rejection, and temporary oblivion. But Spinoza didn't care. Or rather, he cared, but didn't let it stop him. He knew that truth doesn't need crowds to be true. He knew that understanding doesn't depend on approval. He knew that the inner journey is worth it, even if nobody else understands. And they might condemn you for it. They might say you're wasting time, that you're isolating yourself, that you're getting weird. Your choices might be interpreted as arrogance, coldness, or escape. But that doesn't invalidate the truth found. Truth continues being truth. regardless of how many people recognize it. And if you truly found it, if you truly understood something deep about reality, that's enough. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need external confirmation. Truth confirms itself in the clarity it brings, in the peace it generates, in the freedom it offers. For Spinoza, the sage's loneliness isn't despair. It isn't a sign of social failure. It isn't an indication that something went wrong. It's in fact the opposite. It's clarity. It's the state of one who no longer depends on others' approval to feel valid, of one who no longer fears isolation because they've found sufficient company within themselves, of one who no longer needs constant noise because they've learned to appreciate silence. Being alone in this context doesn't mean being lost. It means being centered. It means having found an internal axis that doesn't shake with others' opinions. Most people are afraid of loneliness because when they're alone, they face inner emptiness. They face disturbing thoughts, existential doubts, deep fears. And to escape this, they seek constant distraction. They seek company at any cost. They seek noise that drowns out the internal silence. But the sage, in Spinoza's view, doesn't have this fear, because they've filled the inner void with understanding. When alone, they don't find despair, they find serenity. They don't find boredom, they find contemplation. They don't find fear, they find something greater, understanding. And this understanding becomes sufficient company. Better company, in fact, than most superficial social interactions. Because it's real, it's solid, it's incapable of betraying or abandoning you. It's always there, inside you, illuminating the path. And when you have this, loneliness loses its poison. It becomes just a neutral state, sometimes even desirable, because it's in it that you find yourself again. At the end of the journey, those who seek truth discover something paradoxical. They discover that loneliness isn't an enemy. It isn't an obstacle to be overcome. It isn't a character flaw or sign of social inadequacy. It's, in fact, the necessary condition to see reality as it is. When you're immersed in the crowd, when you're surrounded by opinions, when you're constantly bombarded by social narratives, it becomes impossible to separate what's real from what's collective construction. Everything mixes. External voices get confused with your internal voice. Others' beliefs infiltrate your thoughts, and you lose the ability to see clearly. Loneliness cleans this confusion. It gives you distance. It gives you perspective. It allows you to see the social game from outside, instead of being trapped inside it. And when you see from outside, you notice things that were previously invisible. You notice how people behave in predictable patterns, how they repeat the same mistakes, how they get trapped in the same illusions. And you also notice how difficult it is to help them, because they don't want to be helped. They want confirmation of their beliefs, not challenges. They want comfort, not truth. And you who chose truth can no longer offer only comfort. So you distance yourself, not by will, but by necessity. Like Spinoza, you understand that inner freedom is born when collective noise falls silent, when you stop trying to fit in, when you accept that your path is different, and when you make peace with the loneliness this path brings. Now you understand why this happens. You understand it's not your fault. It's not because you're antisocial or because there's something wrong with you. It's simply because you chose to seek truth in a world that prefers comfortable illusions, and this choice has consequences. But looking at Spinoza, at his solitary but deeply meaningful life, you realize the consequences are worth it. He died at 44, relatively young, alone, without great recognition. But he left a philosophical legacy that crossed centuries. His ideas influenced thinkers around the world. His courage to think freely opened doors for future generations. And more important than all that, he lived according to his convictions. He didn't betray himself. He didn't sell his integrity for social acceptance. He remained faithful to the search for truth, even when it cost everything. And in the end, he had what few have: inner peace, deep understanding, beatitude. He was alone, but he wasn't lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. If you're on this journey now, if you feel loneliness tightening, if you notice the distancing happening, know that you're not alone in this experience. Paradoxically, there are many solitary people like you scattered throughout the world. People who chose truth instead of comfort, who preferred clarity instead of superficial company, who accepted paying the price of lucidity. You don't know each other. You'll probably never meet, but you're making the same journey. Each at your own pace, on your own path, but seeking the same thing: real understanding. And this has value. It has value even without recognition. It has value even without applause, because it transforms you inside. It makes you freer, more conscious, more whole. And when you achieve this, you realize that loneliness was just the door you needed to cross to reach what really matters. On the other side of this door, there are no crowds waiting. There's no welcome party. But there's something better. There's truth. There's clarity. There's peace. And for those who truly seek, that's enough. If this topic touched you in some way, if you recognized your own journey in these words, leave your like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we explore deep ideas about philosophy, consciousness, and the search for truth. And who knows, in this community, you might find other solitary people walking in the same direction.